On the morning of March 17, 1983, inside a secure office on the fourth floor of the CIA's Counterintelligence Division in Langley, Virginia, a man named David Marshall placed 3 photographs on his desk and felt his entire world collapse. The photographs showed a woman. Dark hair, green eyes, a slight scar above her left eyebrow from a childhood accident she'd described to him 100 times. The woman in the photos was meeting with a known KGB handler outside a cafe in Vienna. The woman in the photos was passing a manila envelope across a table. The woman in the photos was his wife. David didn't move. He didn't breathe. He simply stared at the images as if they were a language he'd forgotten how to read. Around him, the office hummed with its usual sounds: typewriters clacking, telephones ringing, voices discussing surveillance reports and encryption patterns. But for David, there was only silence. The terrible, crushing silence of betrayal. Her name was Alina. Or at least, that's what she'd told him when they met 7 years ago at a State Department reception. She worked as a translator, she'd said, Russian and French. Her father had been a diplomat. She'd grown up between Moscow and Paris, which explained her slight accent, the way she softened her consonants, the way certain English words still felt foreign on her tongue. David had fallen in love with that accent, with her intelligence, with the way she looked at him as if he were the only honest man in a city built on lies. They'd married within a year. A small ceremony in Georgetown, just family and a few friends. His colleagues from the agency had joked about him marrying a Russian translator. Watch out. Marshall, she might be a honeypot, but they'd been laughing. Everyone laughed in Ijo Chilil. Détente was the word of the decade. Nixon had gone to Moscow. Ford had signed Helsinki. The Cold War, people said, was thawing. But it wasn't. David knew that better than most. He'd spent the last decade hunting Soviet intelligence officers who operated under diplomatic cover. He'd read thousands of surveillance reports, analyzed countless intercepts, built profiles of KGB operatives who lived in American suburbs and coached Little League while stealing nuclear secrets. He knew how they worked. He knew how they thought. He knew how they recruited, how they manipulated, how they disappeared people who became inconvenient. And now, holding these photographs in his hands, he realized he'd been sleeping next to one of them for 7 years. The photos had arrived in a sealed envelope that morning, delivered by a courier from the FBI's Washington field office. No note, no explanation. Just the images and a case number, CI 224783. David had opened the envelope expecting routine surveillance material, some mid-level Soviet trade official caught meeting an American with security clearance. He reviewed these kinds of cases constantly. It was his job to identify patterns, to spot recruitment attempts, to protect American intelligence assets from Soviet penetration. He hadn't expected to see his own wife. The first photo showed her walking along Quantener Strage in Vienna's First District. She wore a cream-colored coat he'd bought her for Christmas 2 years ago. Her hair was pulled back in the way she wore it when she wanted to look professional. She carried a leather handbag, the brown one she always took when traveling. Everything about the image was familiar. Painfully, impossibly familiar. The second photo captured the moment of contact. A man in his 50s, gray suit, unremarkable face, the kind of face that disappears in a crowd. According to the notes attached to the surveillance log, his name was Yuri Volkov, second secretary at the Soviet embassy in Vienna, confirmed KGB officer with the rank of major. He and Alina sat at an outdoor table at CAF Central. Between them, clearly visible in the photograph, was a manila envelope. The third photo showed Alina's hand reaching across the table, Volkov's hand meeting hers, the envelope changing possession. The photograph had been taken with a telephoto lens from across the street, but the image was sharp enough to see the expression on Alina's face. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't afraid. She looked calm, professional, like someone who'd done this many times before. The surveillance had been conducted by Austrian intelligence on behalf of the FBI, following a tip from an undisclosed source. The operation had begun 3 weeks ago, when Alina had traveled to Vienna for what she'd told David was a conference on simultaneous interpretation techniques. She'd shown him the invitation. She'd kissed him goodbye at Dulles Airport. She'd called him every night from her hotel room to tell him about the sessions, about the city, about how much she missed him. She'd been lying. About the conference, about the calls, probably about everything. David sat motionless at his desk, the photographs spread before him like evidence at a trial. His training told him what he should do. Protocol was clear. If a CIA officer discovered that their spouse might be compromised, they were required to report it immediately to the Office of Security. A full investigation would be launched. The spouse would be placed under surveillance. Bank records, phone logs, travel history, everything would be examined. If evidence of espionage was found, the FBI would make an arrest. If the spouse was a foreign intelligence officer, they'd be declared persona non grata and expelled from the country. If they'd operated under false identity, they'd face prosecution for espionage, which carried a maximum sentence of death. His wife could be executed for what she'd done. But David didn't reach for the phone. He didn't walk to his supervisor's office. He didn't follow protocol. Instead, he sat in his chair and tried to remember the last 7 years of his life, searching for the moment when everything had gone wrong. When had she been recruited? Had she been an agent all along? Had their entire marriage been an operation? He thought about their first meeting. It had been at a reception for visiting Soviet cultural delegations, musicians, writers, artists approved by Moscow to represent Soviet culture abroad. Elena had been translating for a poet who spoke no English. David had been there in an unofficial capacity, observing, taking mental notes on who spoke to whom. He'd noticed her immediately. Not because she was beautiful, though she was. Not because she was charming, though she was that too. He'd noticed her because she seemed uncomfortable, out of place. She'd translated the poet's grandiose statements about Soviet literature with a faint smile that suggested she found the whole performance slightly absurd. During a break, he'd approached her. They'd talked about translation, about language, about the impossibility of truly capturing meaning when moving between Russian and English. She'd been funny, self-deprecating. She'd made a joke about the poet nothing treasonous, just gently mocking his ego, and David had laughed. It had felt genuine, real. Had it been? Or had she spotted him first? Had she known who he worked for? Had she approached him with purpose, with orders, with a mission to get close to someone inside American intelligence? David picked up the first photograph again. Elena on a Vienna street. Elena in the coat he'd given her. He tried to see her as a stranger would, as an intelligence analyst would. He tried to look past his feelings and see only the facts. Female. Early 30s. Native Russian speaker with fluent French and English, translator with access to sensitive diplomatic communications, married to a CIA counterintelligence officer, perfect cover, perfect access, perfect target. His hands were shaking as the office around him continued its normal rhythm. A secretary walked past his desk carrying a stack of file folders. Someone laughed in the hallway. A telephone rang 3 times before someone answered. The world was continuing as if nothing had changed. But for David, everything had changed. His marriage was a lie. His wife was a spy. And he had to decide what to do about it. The rational choice was obvious. Report her. Let the system handle it. He was a professional. He'd sworn an oath to protect his country. Personal feelings couldn't matter. Shouldn't matter. But the irrational part of him, the part that still loved her, that still remembered the way she laughed at his terrible jokes, that still felt the warmth of her body next to his in bed, that part was screaming at him to stop, to think, to understand before acting. Because there was another possibility, one that terrified him more than betrayal. What if Elena was the victim? David had spent his career studying Soviet intelligence operations. He knew how they worked. The KGB didn't just recruit people, they owned them. They found leverage. They exploited weaknesses. They used family back home as hostages. They threatened, coerced, manipulated. They turned ordinary people into instruments of espionage, not through ideology but through fear. What if Alina had been forced into this? What if she'd been threatened? What if she'd been trying to protect someone, her family in Russia? Perhaps Anne had no choice but to cooperate. The photographs didn't show her motivation. They showed only her actions. And actions, David knew, could be interpreted in multiple ways. Was she a committed Soviet agent? Or a terrified woman trapped by circumstances beyond her control? He needed to know. Before he made any decision, before he destroyed both their lives, he needed to understand the truth. David placed the photographs back in the envelope and locked them in his desk drawer. He stood, straightened his tie, and walked to the elevator with the practiced calm of someone who hadn't just discovered his entire life was a carefully constructed illusion. He rode down to the parking garage, got into his car, and drove home to the 2-story Colonial in McLean, where he and Elena had lived for the past 4 years. The house looked exactly as it always did. White paint, black shutters, a small garden where Elena grew tomatoes every summer. Their neighbors were a lawyer and a dentist. They had barbecues on weekends. They talked about property taxes and school districts. It was the most ordinary street in the most ordinary suburb in America. David parked in the driveway and sat for a moment, staring at the front door. Behind that door was his wife. Behind that door were 7 years of shared life, dinners and arguments, vacations and illnesses, mundane moments and profound ones. Behind that door was the woman he'd promised to love and protect. Behind that door was a Soviet intelligence officer. He got out of the car and walked inside. Alina was in the kitchen preparing dinner. She wore jeans and a sweater. Her hair was loose around her shoulders. She was chopping vegetables for a salad, humming something, a Russian folk song maybe, or something by Vysotsky, the poet-singer she loved. She looked up when he entered, smiled that familiar smile, and said, "You're home early." David looked at her, really looked at her, searching for signs of deception, searching for evidence of the person in the photographs. But all he saw was Alina, his Alina, the woman who made coffee for him every morning, the woman who fell asleep reading mystery novels, the woman who cried during sad movies and laughed at absurdist comedy. "Slow day," he said. "Good. I'm making chicken, the way you like it, with rosemary." She turned back to the cutting board. David watched her hands moving, precise and practiced. Those hands had passed documents to a KGB officer. Those hands had betrayed American intelligence. Those hands had touched his face, held his hand, made him believe in something that might not be real. "How was Vienna?" he asked. She didn't hesitate, didn't flinch. Exhausting, but productive. "I learned some new techniques for handling technical translation, legal terminology, mostly. Could be useful." She was good, extremely good. Her lies flowed naturally without pause or nervousness. Was that because she'd been trained? Or because she'd been lying so long it had become automatic? "Did you see much of the city?" David asked, keeping his voice casual. "A little. Walked around the old quarter. Had coffee at a few cafes. It's beautiful there. We should go together sometime. Had coffee at a few cafes." The truth hidden inside the lie. David felt something dark and cold settle in his chest. She was admitting to part of it, the part that seemed innocent, the part that could be verified. A skilled liar always included verifiable details to make the lie more believable. "I'd like that," he said. Alina finished the salad and moved to the stove. David stood in the doorway watching her, trying to reconcile the woman before him with the woman in the photographs. Were they the same person? Or had he been living with someone who'd never really existed, David? Elena's voice pulled him from his thoughts. She was looking at him with concern. "Are you okay? You seem distant, just tired," he said. "Bad day at work?" "Nothing unusual. Just the usual Cold War paranoia." She smiled at that. "Your job. Always so serious. Always looking for spies." The irony wasn't lost on him. They ate dinner together. They talked about nothing important, weather, news, weekend plans. They moved through the rituals of married life with practiced ease. But David was aware, suddenly and painfully, of how much of their life together was performance. Had it always been this way? Had they always been acting? Or was this new, the distance, the distrust, the sense that they were strangers sharing a meal? After dinner, Alina went upstairs to take a bath. David cleaned the kitchen, loading dishes into the dishwasher with mechanical precision. His mind was racing, analyzing possibilities, calculating risks. He needed information. He needed to understand what Alina was really doing, who she was working for, what she'd compromised. And he needed to do it without her knowing he knew. He walked quietly upstairs. The bathroom door was closed, water running. He went to their bedroom and stood for a moment, looking at the space they shared. The bed they slept in, the dresser where she kept her clothes, the nightstand where she kept the mystery novels she loved. He began to search. He did it carefully, professionally, leaving no trace of his presence. He checked the dresser drawers, looking for false bottoms or hidden compartments. He examined her jewelry box, searching for anything unusual: dead drop instructions, encryption keys, microfilm. He went through her closet, checking coat pockets, shoe boxes, the lining of her handbags. Nothing. He moved to her nightstand. Inside were books, reading glasses, hand lotion, sleeping pills prescribed after her father died 3 years ago. He opened each book, checking for hollowed-out pages or hidden documents. He found nothing. He was about to give up when he noticed the sleeping pills. The prescription was recent, filled 2 weeks ago, but the bottle was nearly full. Alina took one pill occasionally when she couldn't sleep, maybe once a month. The bottle should have shown more use over 2 weeks, unless she'd gotten the prescription for a different reason. David unscrewed the cap and poured the pills into his palm. They looked normal, small, white, unremarkable. But when he looked closer, he noticed that 2 of them seemed slightly different, slightly larger. The coating not quite the same texture. He took those 2 pills and put the others back in the bottle. He slipped the suspicious pills into his pocket, replaced the bottle exactly where he'd found it, and left the bedroom. The water was still running in the bathroom. Alina was humming the same Russian folk song. David went downstairs, took the 2 pills from his pocket, and examined them under better light. The coating was definitely different, thicker, more opaque. He pressed gently on one of them with his fingernail, and the coating cracked slightly. Inside wasn't medication. It was a tightly rolled piece of paper. With steady hands, David carefully removed the coating from both pills. The paper inside each one was tiny, no larger than a fingernail. On each paper was a series of numbers and letters, coordinates, dates, meeting locations, instructions for dead drops or live meets with handlers. His wife wasn't just a spy. She was an active operational intelligence officer. David stood in his kitchen holding evidence that could send Alina to prison for the rest of her life, and felt something inside him break. Not anger, not rage, just a profound, devastating sadness. Because whatever they'd had, whatever he'd thought they'd had, was gone. The woman he'd loved either never existed or had betrayed him so completely that love no longer mattered. He heard the water stop upstairs, heard Alina moving around in the bathroom. He quickly rolled the papers back up, recotted them as best he could, and returned them to the pill bottle before she came downstairs. When Alina appeared, wrapped in a robe, her hair damp, she looked peaceful, content. She smiled at him and said, "I'm going to bed early. That trip exhausted me." "I'll be up soon," David said. She kissed him on the cheek, casual marital kiss, and went upstairs. David waited until he heard the bedroom door close, then sat down at the kitchen table and put his head in his hands. He had a choice to make. The most important choice of his life. He could report her. Follow protocol. Let the FBI arrest her. Watch her be charged with espionage. Watch her trial, her conviction, her imprisonment or execution. He would be doing his duty. Protecting his country. Following his oath. Or he could try to understand why. Try to reach her. Try to find out if there was anything real between them, any truth beneath the lies. Try to save her, even if it meant risking everything he'd worked for. The rational choice was clear. The emotional choice was impossible. David sat in his kitchen until midnight, thinking about a woman he'd thought he knew, a marriage that might have been a mission, and a decision that would define the rest of his life. In the end, he made the only choice he could live with. He would investigate her himself, quietly, carefully. He would find out who she really was, what she was really doing, and why. And then, only then, would he decide what to do. It was a dangerous choice. If the agency discovered he knew about Alina and hadn't reported her, he'd be finished. Arrested for obstruction, possibly charged as an accessory. His career would be destroyed. His reputation ruined. He might go to prison himself. But he couldn't destroy her without knowing the truth. He couldn't condemn her without understanding her. Because despite everything, despite the photographs, despite the hidden instructions, despite the betrayal, part of him still loved her. And that part wouldn't let him make a decision until he knew whether she deserved to be saved. The next morning, David went back to Langley and began his investigation. Not officially, not through proper channels. He used his access to classified databases to search for any mention of Alina's name in intelligence reports. He reviewed surveillance logs from Soviet diplomatic facilities, looking for patterns that might match her travel schedule. He contacted trusted colleagues in friendly intelligence services, the British, the Germans, the French, and asked carefully worded questions about Soviet operations in their jurisdictions. He found nothing definitive, but he found suggestions, hints, small anomalies that painted a disturbing picture. A report from MI6 mentioned a Soviet intelligence officer using the cover of a translator, who'd been active in London in the early 1970s. No name given, but the description matched Alina. An intercept from French intelligence showed a communication between Moscow Center and the Soviet Embassy in Paris referencing an asset codenamed Lyric who'd successfully infiltrated American diplomatic circles. The timeline matched Alina's arrival in the United States. A German surveillance report described a meeting between a KGB handler and an unidentified woman at a cafe in Vienna 3 weeks ago, the same cafe where Alina had met Yuri Volkov. The evidence was circumstantial, but it was building. Alina wasn't just an opportunistic recruit. She was a trained intelligence officer, possibly someone who'd been inserted into American society with a long-term mission, a sleeper agent. And she'd married a CIA counterintelligence officer, which meant either she'd gotten extremely lucky or David himself had been the target all along. That possibility made him feel physically ill. Had Alina married him because she loved him? Or because he worked for the CIA? Had their entire relationship been designed to give her access to American intelligence? David needed to know. And there was only one way to find out. He decided to set a trap. That evening, he came home and told Alina that he'd be traveling to New York the following week for a joint CIA-FBI operation. It wasn't true, but she wouldn't know that. He described the operation in vague terms. Something about tracking a Soviet trade delegation suspected of technology theft. He mentioned the dates, the hotels they'd be using, the level of security. It was all fiction. But if Alina was reporting to Moscow, she'd pass the information to her handlers. And David would be watching. Alina listened with apparent interest, asked appropriate questions, expressed mild concern about him being away for several days. She behaved exactly as a normal spouse would. But David was watching her carefully now, looking for signs of deception. Looking for the moment when she shifted from wife to intelligence officer. He didn't see it. Which meant either she was extremely well trained, or he was wrong about everything. Over the next 3 days, David implemented a careful surveillance operation. He had a friend in the FBI's technical services install listening devices in their home-hidden microphones in the kitchen, bedroom, and study. He arranged for surveillance teams to watch their house and follow Alina whenever she left. He monitored her phone calls. He tracked her movements. It was illegal without a warrant. It was a massive violation of protocol. If anyone discovered what he was doing, he'd be arrested. But David had crossed a line he couldn't uncross. He'd committed himself to finding the truth, no matter the cost. For 2 days, Elena behaved normally. She went to work at the State Department's translation office. She met friends for coffee. She went grocery shopping. She called her mother in New York, or the woman David had always believed was her mother. She did nothing suspicious. Then on the third day, everything changed. David was at Langley, listening to the surveillance feeds through headphones in a secure room he'd commandeered for his unauthorized operation. He heard Elena moving around the house, making coffee, opening the newspaper. Nothing unusual. Then he heard her pick up the phone. She dialed a number, waited. A man's voice answered, speaking Russian. Elena responded in Russian. David's Russian was functional but not fluent, so he grabbed a notepad and transcribed as much as he could, planning to have it translated later. The conversation lasted 3 minutes. Elena spoke in low, careful tones. She mentioned David's travel plans to New York. She provided the dates, the hotels, the security protocols, exactly what he'd told her. She asked about next steps. The man on the other end gave her instructions for a meeting in 2 days at a location in Georgetown. When she hung up, David sat motionless, the headphones still on, listening to Elena move through the house. She was humming again, that same Russian folk song. She sounded peaceful, content, like someone who'd just completed a routine task. She'd just confirmed his worst fears. Elena wasn't a victim. She wasn't being coerced. She was a fully operational Soviet intelligence officer, actively betraying American intelligence. And she'd used their marriage as cover for 7 years. David removed the headphones. His hands were steady. His mind was clear. He'd gotten his answer. Now he had to decide what to do with it. The law was clear. His duty was clear. He should report her immediately. Let the FBI make an arrest. Let justice follow its course. Elena would be charged with espionage. She'd face trial. If convicted, she could receive a life sentence or death, but that was the price of betrayal. That was the consequence of treason, but David couldn't do it. Not yet. Because there was still one question that haunted him, one truth he needed to know before he destroyed her. Had she ever loved him, or had it all been a lie? He needed to confront her, face to face. He needed to see her eyes when he asked her that question. He needed to know if anything between them had been real. It was foolish, dangerous, emotionally reckless. But David had already crossed so many lines that one more didn't matter. He'd become obsessed not just with catching her, but with understanding her. He needed to know who she really was, what she really felt, whether the woman he'd loved had ever existed. So he made a plan. 2 days later, David told Elena he was going to New York as scheduled. He left the house early, drove to the airport, and boarded a shuttle to New York. But instead of staying there, he caught an immediate return flight and came back to Washington that same afternoon. He knew from the surveillance that Elena had a meeting scheduled that evening at 8 o'clock at a bookstore in Georgetown. A meeting with her handler. David arrived at the bookstore at 7:30 and positioned himself in a corner where he could watch without being seen. At 8 o'clock exactly, Elena walked in. She wore dark clothes. Her hair was pulled back. She moved with purpose, without hesitation. She went to the foreign language section, pulled a book from the shelf, Fuxian poetry, and opened it. Inside was a folded piece of paper. She read it quickly, returned the book to the shelf, and left the store. David followed her. She walked 3 blocks to a small park. She sat on a bench, waiting. 10 minutes later, a man approached, Yuri Volkov. The same man from the Vienna photographs. They spoke briefly in Russian. Volkov handed her an envelope. Elena gave him something in return. David couldn't see what. They separated after less than 2 minutes. David had seen enough. He followed Elena as she walked back toward their car, parked several blocks away. He waited until she reached a quiet street, mostly empty at this hour. Then he stepped out of the shadows and said her name, Elena. She froze, turned, saw him. And in that moment, David watched her face transform. Shock, fear, then something else. Resignation, maybe. Acceptance. The look of someone who'd been caught and knew there was no way out. "David," she said quietly, "you're supposed to be in New York." "I know," he said. "Just like you're supposed to be my wife." They stood facing each other on a dark Georgetown street. Two people who'd shared 7 years of married life. Two people who suddenly realized they'd never really known each other at all. "How long have you known?" Alina asked. Her voice was calm, professional. The voice of an intelligence officer, not a wife. "Long enough," she nodded, looked away. When she looked back, her eyes were different, harder. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know yet," David said. "That depends on you." "On me?" "I need to know something," David said, "and I need you to tell me the truth. Just this once. Can you do that?" Alina didn't answer. "Was any of it real?" David asked. "Did you ever love me? Or was it all just part of the mission?" For a long moment, Alina was silent. The street around them was empty. Somewhere in the distance, a car passed. The city hummed with its usual nighttime sounds. But between them, there was only silence. Finally, Alina spoke. "Does it matter?" "To me it does." "Why? What difference would it make? Would it change what I am? What I've done? Would it change what you have to do?" "Maybe," David said. "I don't know. But I need to know anyway." Alina looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time since he'd discovered the truth, David saw something that might have been genuine emotion in her eyes. Sadness, maybe. Regret. Or perhaps just exhaustion. "You want the truth?" she said. "The truth is complicated. The truth is I don't even know anymore. Yes, I was assigned to get close to you. Yes, our meeting was planned. Yes, I married you because Moscow ordered me to. But somewhere along the way—" She paused, searching for words. "Somewhere along the way it stopped being just an assignment. You were kind. You were decent. You were everything they told me Americans weren't. And double quotes, she didn't finish, but David understood. You fell in love with me," he said. "I fell in love with the life we had," Alina corrected. "I fell in love with the idea of being someone else, someone normal. Someone who could just exist without constantly lying, constantly watching, constantly being afraid. But love you? I don't know. I've been lying for so long I'm not sure I know what real feelings are anymore." It was the most honest thing she'd ever said to him, and it broke his heart. "What do you want me to do, Alina?" David asked. "Do you want me to report you? To let you go? To pretend I don't know? Tell me what you want." Alina smiled, a sad, bitter smile. "What I want doesn't matter. It never has. I'm a Soviet intelligence officer. You're a CIA counterintelligence officer. Our jobs are to destroy each other. That's what we were always meant to do. Everything else was just delay. It doesn't have to be that way." "Yes, David, it does." She reached into her bag, and David tensed, wondering if she was reaching for a weapon. But she only pulled out her car keys. "I'm going to walk to my car now," she said. "I'm going to drive away. And you're going to let me. Because if you try to stop me, I'll have to hurt you. And I don't want to do that. Despite everything, I don't want to hurt you. Alina, don't follow me," she said. "Don't try to find me. Go home. Call whoever you need to call. Report what you know. Do your job. But give me a few hours first. That's all I'm asking. A few hours to disappear before they start looking." David stood in the street, watching his wife, his enemy, walk away from him. Every instinct, every bit of training, every oath he'd taken told him to stop her, to arrest her, to prevent a trained Soviet intelligence officer from escaping. But he didn't move. He just stood there and watched her go. Because despite everything, despite the lies, despite the betrayal, despite the fact that she'd used him for 7 years, part of him still loved her, or loved who he'd thought she was. And that part couldn't condemn her. Not yet. Alina reached her car. She opened the door, paused, and looked back at him one last time. Their eyes met across the dark street. And in that moment, David saw everything: the sadness, the regret, the exhaustion of living a double life. He saw a woman who'd spent so long pretending to be someone else that she'd forgotten who she really was. Then she got in the car and drove away. David stood on the empty street for a long time, watching the taillights disappear into the Washington night. He knew what he had to do. He knew what his job required. But he gave her the time she'd asked for. 3 hours. 3 hours before, he called his supervisor and reported everything. It wasn't much, but it was all he could give her. When the FBI raided their house the next morning, Elena was gone. She'd taken nothing, no clothes, no photos, no evidence of the life they'd shared. She'd simply vanished, like a ghost who'd never existed in the first place. The investigation that followed was massive and humiliating. David was interrogated for weeks. His entire career was examined. His every decision, every action, every moment of his marriage was scrutinized. Colleagues who'd trusted him looked at him with suspicion. Friends stopped calling. His reputation was destroyed. But he was never charged with any crime. The investigators concluded that he'd been a dupe, a target exploited by a sophisticated Soviet operation. They believed he'd known nothing until he discovered the photographs. They believed he'd done his duty as soon as he'd learned the truth. They were wrong. But David never corrected them. Elena was never found. She disappeared completely. Soviet records captured after the Cold War ended suggested she'd been extracted through Canada and returned to Moscow, where she'd been decorated for her service. But there was no confirmation, no proof, just rumors and unverified intelligence reports. David left the CIA 6 months later. He couldn't stay. Couldn't continue working counterintelligence knowing he'd compromised himself. He moved to a small town in Vermont, took a job teaching high school history, and tried to build a quiet life far from Washington's secrets and lies. He never remarried, never even dated. Because how could he trust anyone after Elena? How could he open himself to someone knowing that love could be a weapon, that intimacy could be manipulation, that the person sleeping next to you might be your enemy? Years passed. The Cold War ended. The Berlin Wall fell. The Soviet Union collapsed. The world moved on, but David never forgot. He never forgot the woman he'd loved, the woman who'd betrayed him, the woman who'd shown him that in the shadow war between superpowers, nothing was sacred. Not love, not trust, not even the truth. And sometimes, late at night, he wondered if Elena ever thought about him, if she ever regretted what she'd done, if any part of their life together had meant something to her. He wondered, but he never knew, because that was the nature of the Cold War. It took everything, loyalty, love, identity, and turned it into a weapon. It made enemies of lovers and strangers of the people you thought you knew. It destroyed lives quietly, without mercy, without witnesses. And the casualties were rarely recorded in any official history. David Marshall taught American history at Burlington High School for 17 years. He was a good teacher, patient, knowledgeable, able to make the past feel immediate and real to students who'd been born after the Berlin Wall fell. He taught them about the Cold War as if it were ancient history, a conflict between superpowers that seemed almost mythological now that it was over. He never told them he'd lived through it, never mentioned that he'd worked for the CIA, never explained that he understood the paranoia, the fear, the constant sense of threat, not from textbooks but from experience. He especially never told them about Elena. His students saw a quiet, slightly distant man who wore sweaters and drank too much coffee, and sometimes stared out the window during lectures, as if he were seeing something they couldn't. They liked him. They respected him. But they never really knew him. No one did. In 2001, on a cold morning in March, David received a letter. It arrived at the school, addressed to him personally with no return address. The envelope was cream-colored, expensive paper, the kind used for formal correspondence. His name was written in elegant handwriting that made his heart stop. He recognized that handwriting. He'd seen it on grocery lists, birthday cards, notes left on the kitchen counter. He'd seen it every day for 7 years. Elena. David took the letter to his classroom during lunch period, when the building was mostly empty. He sat at his desk and stared at the envelope for a long time before opening it. Part of him wanted to burn it unopened. Part of him wanted to throw it away. but a larger part, the part that had never stopped wondering, needed to know what it said. He opened it carefully, his hand steadier than he'd expected. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the same elegant handwriting. The letter was in English, not Russian. It was dated 2 weeks earlier. David, I don't know if this letter will reach you. I don't know if you'll read it if it does. But I'm writing it anyway, because there are things I should have said 18 years ago, and I've carried them with me like stones ever since. You asked me once if any of it was real, if I ever loved you. I didn't give you a good answer. I'm not sure I had one then, but I have one now. Yes, not at first. At first, you were an assignment, a target, a means to an end. I was instructed to get close to an American intelligence officer to establish trust, to extract information over time. You were selected because you were single, relatively isolated, and seemed vulnerable to romantic manipulation. Those were the words in my briefing file, vulnerable to romantic manipulation. They were wrong about you. You weren't vulnerable. You were just decent. You were honest in a city built on deception. You believed in things, in truth, in justice, in the idea that people could be better than their worst impulses. I'd been trained to exploit that kind of belief, to see it as weakness. But I couldn't, because the more time I spent with you, the more I realized you weren't naive. You knew the world was dark. You knew people lied and betrayed and destroyed each other. But you chose to be decent anyway. You chose to believe in something better. And that wasn't weakness. That was strength I'd never encountered before. I fell in love with that strength. And then I fell in love with you. I know you won't believe that. Why should you? Everything about our life together was built on lies. But the lies became real somewhere along the way. When you came home tired and I made you dinner. When you told me about your day and I listened. When we sat together on the couch reading, not talking, just being together. Those moments weren't pretend. They were the only real things in my life. But I couldn't stop being what I was. I had family in Moscow, my mother, my younger brother, who would suffer if I defected. I had handlers who monitored my every move. I had orders I couldn't disobey without putting everyone I loved at risk, so I kept lying, kept pretending, kept living 2 lives at once. The worst part wasn't the fear of being caught. The worst part was watching you trust me. Watching you love me, knowing I was betraying you every day, knowing that when you found out and I knew you would eventually, it would destroy something good in you, and I hated myself for that. When you confronted me that night in Georgetown, I saw it in your eyes. The moment trust died. The moment you realized I'd turned love into a weapon, and I've carried that look with me every day since. I want you to know that I never passed any critical intelligence. I gave them scraps, things they could have learned from newspapers, low-level diplomatic gossip, nothing that endangered operations or agents. When they pushed for more, I lied to them too. I told them you never discussed work at home. I told them you were too careful, too professional. I protected you even while I was betraying you. I know that doesn't excuse what I did. Nothing excuses it. But I need you to know that I tried, in my own inadequate way, to do as little damage as possible. After I left Washington, I was brought back to Moscow. I was debriefed for months. They considered my operation a failure because I hadn't delivered significant intelligence. They suspected I'd been compromised emotionally. They were right. I was given a desk job, analysis, translation, nothing operational. They didn't trust me anymore, and I was grateful for that, because I couldn't do it again. Couldn't lie to someone the way I'd lied to you. Couldn't turn intimacy into betrayal. I never married again, never even tried. How could I? You were the only real thing I ever had, and I destroyed it. When the Soviet Union collapsed, I had the option to start over. Many former intelligence officers did. They disappeared into new lives, new identities. But I didn't. I stayed in Moscow. I took care of my mother until she died 3 years ago. I work as a translator now, freelance, mostly technical documents. It's quiet, anonymous, exactly what I deserve. I'm writing this because I heard, through channels I won't specify, that you left the agency, that you became a teacher. And I wanted you to know that I'm glad. Glad you got out. Glad you found something else. I hope you found peace, David. I hope you found a way to trust people again. I hope I didn't destroy that in you. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even deserve understanding. I just wanted you to know the truth. The real truth. Not the truth that protects me or justifies what I did, but the truth that hurts. I loved you. I love you still. And I'm sorry. For all of it. I hope you're happy, David. I hope you found a life worth living. You deserve so much better than what I gave you. Elena David sat in his empty classroom, holding the letter, reading it twice, then 3 times. Outside, students were returning from lunch, filling the hallways with noise and life. But in his classroom, there was only silence. He didn't know what to feel. Anger? Relief? Grief? All of it? None of it? For 18 years, he'd carried the weight of Elena's betrayal like a wound that never healed. He'd questioned everything, his judgment, his ability to read people, his capacity to trust. He'd built walls around himself, convinced that intimacy was dangerous, that love was a liability. And now, reading her words, he realized that she'd carried her own weight, her own wounds, her own regret. Did that change anything? Did knowing she'd loved him make the betrayal less painful? Did understanding her motives make what she'd done forgivable? No. But it made it human. David folded the letter carefully and placed it in his desk drawer. He didn't know what he'd do with it. Didn't know if he'd keep it or destroy it. Didn't know if he'd ever read it again. But for the first time in 18 years, he felt something other than anger when he thought about Elena. He felt something like understanding. Not forgiveness exactly, but the recognition that she too had been trapped. That the Cold War hadn't just destroyed their marriage, it had destroyed her ability to be anything other than what her country had made her. The bell rang. Students filed into his classroom, chattering and laughing. David stood, straightened his shoulders, and began his lecture on the Marshall Plan and post-war reconstruction. He talked about how nations rebuilt after devastation, how people found ways to create something new from ruins, how the world moved forward even after terrible destruction. He didn't talk about how some ruins could never be rebuilt, how some wounds never healed, how some people never recovered from the wars they'd fought, the secret ones, the personal ones, the ones that left no visible scars. But he thought about it. He thought about Elena in Moscow, translating technical documents in some anonymous office. He thought about himself in Vermont, teaching history to children who'd never lived through what he'd lived through. He thought about 2 people who'd loved each other across an ideological divide and been destroyed by forces larger than themselves. The Cold War had ended. The superpowers had stood down. The threat of nuclear annihilation had receded. The world had declared peace. But for David and Elena, the war had never ended. It had just gone quiet. It had retreated into their separate lives, their separate cities, their separate memories. It lived in the silence between them, thousands of miles of distance, 18 years of time, and all the things they'd never be able to say to each other. That evening, David went home to his small apartment near the lake. He made dinner chicken with rosemary, the way Elena used to make it. He hadn't cooked it in 18 years, but tonight he wanted to. Maybe as a way of acknowledging her letter. Maybe as a way of acknowledging that what they'd had, however brief and broken, had mattered. He ate alone, as he always did. Then he sat by the window and watched the sun set over Lake Champlain, painting the sky in shades of red and gold. He thought about Elena's question in her letter. I hope you found a life worth living. Had he? He'd survived. He'd built something resembling a life. He had work he found meaningful, students who appreciated him, a routine that brought comfort. He'd found peace of a sort, the peace of resignation, of acceptance, of learning to live with permanent damage. But happiness? Joy? The sense that life was full rather than merely endurable? No. He hadn't found that. The Cold War had taken it from him, and he'd never gotten it back. But maybe that was okay. Maybe survival was enough. Maybe building something small and quiet and stable in the aftermath of destruction was its own kind of victory. David finished his dinner and washed the dishes. He walked to his bookshelf and pulled out a volume of Russian poetry Akhmatova, one of Elena's favorites. He'd kept it all these years, hidden among his other books, a remnant of a life he'd tried to forget. He opened it randomly and read, "Everything is plundered, betrayed, sold. Death's great black wing scrapes the air, misery gnaws to the bone. Why then do we not despair? Why indeed? Because humans were resilient. Because they built lives even in the ruins. Because they found meaning even in devastation. Because they kept going even when everything they'd believed in had been destroyed." David closed the book and returned it to the shelf. He would keep Elena's letter. He wouldn't respond to it. There was nothing to say, no way to bridge the distance between them, but he would keep it, as evidence, as memory, as proof that what they'd shared, however compromised, had been real enough to haunt them both. The years continued. David kept teaching. Spring turned to summer, summer to fall, fall to winter. Seasons passed with the steady, indifferent rhythm of time. Students came and went. Colleagues retired. The world changed around him while he remained constant, unchanging, a man frozen at the moment of betrayal, unable to move forward or back. In 2011, 33 years after he'd discovered Elena's betrayal, David received another letter. This one came through official channels forwarded by his old agency. Marked personal and confidential. The letter was from a Russian woman named Katerina Volkov. She identified herself as Elena's niece. The letter was brief and formal. "Mr. Marshall, I am writing to inform you that my aunt, Elena Sergeyevna Volkov, passed away on January 12, 2011, in Moscow. She died peacefully, of heart failure, at the age of 68. Before her death, she asked me to contact you if possible. She wanted you to know that she thought of you often in her final years. She wanted you to know that you were remembered with affection and regret. She left instructions that certain items should be sent to you if you could be located. These items are enclosed. With respect, Katerina Volkov." Inside the envelope were 3 photographs. The first showed a young couple at a small wedding ceremony in Georgetown. David recognized it immediately, their wedding day. He was wearing a suit, smiling awkwardly at the camera. Elena wore a simple white dress and held a small bouquet. They looked young, happy, untouched by what was coming. The second photograph showed the same couple a few years later, on vacation somewhere. A beach. David couldn't remember where. They were standing together, his arm around her shoulders, both of them squinting into the sun. They looked comfortable together, natural, like people who belonged to each other. The third photograph was different. It showed an older woman, Elena, in her 60s, sitting in what looked like a small Moscow apartment. She held a book in her lap. On the wall behind her was a single framed photograph. David couldn't see it clearly, but he knew what it was. Their wedding photo. She'd kept it. For 33 years, through everything, she'd kept it. David sat in his apartment, holding the photographs, and felt something break inside him. Not anger, not grief, something else. Something like release. Elena was gone. Whatever they'd been to each other, lovers, enemies, victims of forces larger than themselves, was finished now. The story was over. There would be no more letters. No more wondering. No more unresolved questions echoing through the decades. It was done. David placed the photographs carefully in an envelope and put them with Elena's letter in his desk drawer. Then he sat by the window and watched the lake, thinking about memory and time and the way people carry each other through life, even after they've parted. He thought about a woman he'd loved and lost. A woman who'd betrayed him and been destroyed by that betrayal. A woman who'd lived the rest of her life alone in Moscow, keeping a wedding photograph on her wall like a shrine to something that might have been. He thought about how the Cold War had taken 2 people who might have loved each other and turned them into casualties. How it had made their marriage a battlefield and their intimacy a weapon. How it had destroyed them both quietly and completely without ever acknowledging what it had done. The sun set. Darkness came. David sat in his apartment and remembered, and for the first time in 33 years he cried, not from anger, Not from betrayal, but from sadness. Pure, uncomplicated sadness for two lives that had been broken by a war they never chose to fight. For a love that had been real enough to survive deception, but not strong enough to survive the systems that created that deception. For all the things they might have been if the world had been different. When the tears stopped, David felt lighter. Emptier. But also, somehow, more complete. The story was finished. Alina was gone. The Cold War had ended decades ago, and he, finally, could let go. He didn't become a different person after that. Didn't suddenly open himself to new relationships or transform his life. He was too old, too set in his ways, too comfortable with solitude, but he did feel different. Less burdened, less trapped in the past. He continued teaching for another 3 years, then retired at 65. He moved to a smaller apartment closer to the lake. He took up fishing. He read books. He walked every morning along the waterfront, watching the seasons change reflected in the water. He lived quietly, peacefully, alone but not entirely lonely. Sometimes on difficult nights he would take out the photographs and look at them, not with anger or regret, but with something like tenderness. Because despite everything, despite the lies and betrayal and destruction, what he and Elena had shared had been real enough to shape both their lives. Real enough to haunt them. Real enough to matter. And maybe that was the truth about the Cold War that history books never captured. It wasn't just about missiles and ideologies and superpower rivalries. It was about millions of individual tragedies, millions of private betrayals. Millions of people whose lives were destroyed not by bombs or battles, but by the simple, terrible fact that they'd been born on opposite sides of an imaginary line. David Marshall died in his sleep on a winter morning in 2019, at the age of 76. He'd been alone for most of his life. He'd never remarried, never had children, never built the kind of family or legacy that people usually measure a life by. But he'd survived. He'd endured. He'd carried the weight of his past without letting it completely destroy him, and in the end that was enough. His nephew, who handled his estate, found the photographs and the letter in David's desk. He read Elena's letter, looked at the photographs, and tried to understand what kind of story they told. But he couldn't. Because you had to have lived through the Cold War to understand. You had to have felt the paranoia, the fear, the sense that trust was dangerous and love could be weaponized. You had to have been there. The nephew threw away most of David's possessions, old furniture, worn clothes, books that no one wanted. But he kept the photographs and the letter. Not because he understood their significance, but because they seemed important. Because they seemed to tell a story worth preserving, even if he didn't fully comprehend it. And maybe that's how all history survives. Not through grand narratives or official records, but through small, private artifacts, photographs, letters, objects that carry meaning only to the people who held them. Evidence of lives lived and loves lost. Proof that behind every historical moment were individual human beings, trying to survive, trying to love, trying to make sense of a world that often made no sense at all. The Cold War ended in 1991. The superpowers declared peace. The world moved on. But for David and Elena, for millions like them, the war never really ended. It just went quiet. It retreated into memory. It lived in the space between what was said and what remained unsaid. In the distance between what was done and what might have been, it lived in photographs kept on walls, in letters written but never sent, in lives shaped by decisions made decades earlier, in the silence between people who once loved each other and could never speak again. And if you listen carefully, if you pay attention to the spaces between the official histories, you can still hear it. The quiet casualties. The private betrayals. The sound of hearts breaking in the service of nations that never acknowledged what they'd destroyed. That's the real story of the Cold War. Not the missiles or the speeches or the grand geopolitical chess games, but the millions of individual tragedies. The countless personal betrayals. The endless procession of people who loved someone they shouldn't have, trusted someone they couldn't, and paid the price for being human in an inhuman time. David and Alina were two among millions. Their story wasn't unique, but it was real, and it mattered, at least to them. And maybe in the end that's enough. To have lived, to have loved, to have tried, to have survived. Even if survival came at the cost of everything else, even if the war never really ended, even if the wounds never really healed, even if freedom, in the end, was just another word for the loneliness of those who couldn't trust anymore. If stories like this make you reflect on how fragile trust really was during the Cold War, how love could be turned into a weapon, how ordinary people became casualties in a war they never chose to fight, consider subscribing. There are many more Cold War stories that should never be forgotten. Stories of people who tried to love in a world that made love dangerous. Stories of choices that destroyed lives. Stories of secrets that shaped history. These stories matter, not because they're dramatic or heroic, but because they're human, because they remind us what it costs when nations treat people as instruments, when ideologies matter more than individuals, when the price of peace is paid in private betrayals. The Cold War may have ended, but its casualties remain. In memories, in photographs, in letters never answered, in lives shaped by decisions made decades ago. These stories deserve to be told. These people deserve to be remembered. Not as heroes or villains, just as human beings who tried to survive an impossible time, who made terrible choices and paid terrible prices, who loved and lost and carried the weight of their secrets until the day they died. That's history too. The quiet kind, the kind that doesn't make headlines, the kind that matters most.